Um, I just can't have you on the podcast and not talk to you about birth. Or do you feel okay if we switch gears a little bit and I
Oh,
ask you
of
some
course.
questions?
Yeah, I love talking about birth.
Okay.
Please.
So you talked about maternal mortality rates in this country. You talked about your own experience as a first-time mother with postpartum depression. Can you shed some light on like what happens during birth that you're aware of, whether that's the biological framework, the spiritual framework, like what is actually going on, and then what's going on in that postpartum time that seems to be so powerful, so vulnerable, so volatile in many ways.
Well, maybe we can riff on this together, Emma, because I know you've thought a lot about this. And, I would say the psychological, spiritual side is something that I think about a lot, but it's not as well articulated. So maybe I'll start with the biology because that's always the
Great.
easiest place. For a lot of women, when you're trying to get pregnant, it's a really interesting window because if you're struggling with it, and I'm not in any way blaming women who have infertility or subfertility, but often that's one of the first places where we're confronted with this experience of our body and, kind of this warm animal that we have to deal with. And if you're someone like me who I used to be like a cortisol junkie, just kind of I wasn't even aware of how much stress I carried in my body. Like the load of cortisol that I was running around with was ridiculous. And I didn't even see it until I was about 35. So a lot of women live that way. And it's like they don't know it until they test. So getting pregnant is kind of this first opportunity. And then pregnancy itself is really a stress test. Like it is the most intense stress test you can imagine. We've all heard about the cardiovascular stress test where you get on a treadmill and you do a Bruce protocol and you go as hard as you can for as long as you can. And you're like running and huffing and puffing. Pregnancy is like that, but it's for 12 months.
It's so
Right?
intense.
So it's a stress test. It's a huge stress test of your cardiovascular system, of your endothelial cells that line your vascular system. We're just learning now about, we know about the 5 traditional risk factors for cardiovascular disease: hypertension, diabetes, smoking, etc. But now there's these 395 other emerging risk factors, things like endometriosis, high blood pressure in pregnancy, preterm labor and delivery, having a small gestational age baby, a weight that's less than the 5th percentile. There's all of these risk factors that portend a greater risk of cardiovascular disease 10, 20, 30 years later.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, it's very interesting stuff. And most OBGYNs have no idea. Most cardiologists have no idea. So there's this profound physical process happening along with the psychological process of preparing to have a baby. And if we just talk about the neuroendocrine system, kind of the hormones, we go from kind of this daily fluctuation that's relatively predictable unless you have polycystic ovary syndrome, another risk factor for cardiovascular disease. But every day, if you have a 28-day cycle, for instance, you've got kind of this level of estrogen and progesterone that fluctuates depending on which day you are. So day 12, you have your peak estradiol. Day 14, you have an LH surge, luteinizing hormone. That then triggers ovulation, then progesterone rises, and it peaks around day 21. So we have kind of this changing level of hormones each day, which I think makes us very accommodating.
I love this. Say more.
So I think there's this veil that we have that kind of makes us roll with the punches because we're used to so much change in terms of our hormones.
Mm-hmm.
And for a lot of women, when they get pregnant, they're like, oh, I'm not dealing with that estrogen progesterone thing every day the way that I have been for the past 24, 30 years. I'm going to speak my truth. Like I'm excited to speak my truth.
Oh my God, I love that.
And so often women have this, kind of honeymoon period during their pregnancy where they feel like really empowered and they really feel embodied and they like, are really at home in their body in a way they haven't been before. That's my hope, right? Like that's kind of the goal.
Mm-hmm.
Medicine often gets in the way and like scares us to death so that it's hard to, inhabit this body. But hopefully you have a good experience. I think, midwives and doulas definitely help with that process. And I learned obstetrics and gynecology originally from midwives. So my model is different than kind of the standard obstetrician model. So you go from this accommodating, day 1 to 28 estrogen and progesterone levels to pretty sky high hormones that make a lot of us feel good. Not everybody, some women with bipolar, a lot of women have depression, a lot of women have anxiety. So there's still issues that we have to deal with. You have these sky high levels of the estrogen in this case, which is a whole family, is estriol, and high levels of progesterone. And then you give birth to this baby and you have hopefully a transcendent experience. And you deliver the baby, you deliver the placenta, and your hormones go from quite high to almost nothing.
Mm.
And that is a whole new kind of stress test. So some women sail through it, no problem. They don't see what the fuss is.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's people like me who have a pretty rocky time. I'm pretty dependent on estradiol and estriol. Mm-hmm. So, I remember Emma with my first baby. It was like day 3 after I delivered her, and I was breastfeeding her. I was like holding her in my arms and like gazing at her. And I started sweating. It was like 68 degrees in our room. I was like sweating profusely.
Yeah.
And I started bawling.
Yes.
And I'm like, what is this? And here I am, an OBGYN. I'm like, oh my goodness, I am having a hot flash. Like, yes. What? So yeah, postpartum is a preview of coming attractions in perimenopause.
So help me understand that. Like, is that for your bio individuality, like how you handle that massive drop in hormones sort of previews how you're going to handle it in menopause?
Yeah, I mean, it tells you hormones are pretty complicated, and it's not just the levels. I'm kind of simplifying in some ways when I talk about the sky high level when you're pregnant and before you give birth and deliver your placenta to having almost nothing. There's other issues too. So it's not just production of hormones, it's also receptor physiology. It's also detoxification. Like, what have you been eating? Have you been eating lots of broccoli and lots of different species of vegetables, or have you been eating Pop-Tarts? Like all of these things are involved. Mm-hmm. But yes, it's this, what women tend to respond to, those of us that are sensitive to it, is the delta. So it's the change in hormones, the change in hormones postpartum, the change in hormones, usually in a good direction during pregnancy, the change in hormones that happens in perimenopause, and then the change of hormones that happens in menopause. Same thing with puberty. So puberty, is like perimenopause in reverse. So it's those transitions that seem to trigger mood issues.
Yes.
For those of us that are sensitive to it.
Yeah. It's so powerful to hear you talk about the science, not being trained in it, because I I had really intense postpartum depression and postpartum anxiety. Like, and I've never had a mood disorder. I have my feelings and I feel things deeply, but I've never struggled with my mental health in that like true kind of struggle way. And it was humbling and terrifying. I thought I was never, I remember saying to my mom, my friends, to Keith, I was just like, I don't know how anybody ever recovers from this.
Yeah.
I mean, it was so life altering, identity altering, and that profundity of exhaustion, like you mentioned earlier, and just like incapable. Like I have to do the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, which is keep another human being alive. And I'm not here to do it.
Yeah.
It was the worst feeling.
It is the worst feeling. And I think in many ways we set women up to fall because we do not tell them about what's happening and we do not support them.
Yeah.
And I want to hear about your experience. My experience when I was postpartum with that first baby, I did not have this experience with my second baby. So the hopeful part here is that you can completely change the architecture of your next birth.
That gives me hope.